but it's really the result of intensity times duration, right? Because we all know there is single instance learning, right? We all know, for most of us, there's been a road to Damascus moment, right? There's been a moment of change where God has impacted our lives, right? And other people have experienced, and some of us have experienced the reverse, right? Where it's been in a moment of trauma, where people learn that the world's a scary place, right? Or they learn that in such a way that their entire life changes, right? So it doesn't always take 21 days to learn something for good or for bad.
That's true.
Right? But that's a matter. So in those cases, what happens in the brain is that it develops much higher activity in one part of the brain than the other, generally one side to the other, depending on what's going to help the brain survive. Because one of the things that is our brains are designed first to help us survive, only second to help us thrive. And so we learn and we respond in ways, and this is an example, and I really am coming to the point of it that I think it really helps to kind of give a larger piece of an understanding of it, that we, in moments of constant helplessness or in single moments of large trauma, our brain looks to figure out what's going to be best for us to survive. And then after that, we're often responding to that old moment instead of this moment, right? We're responding to the wound. We're not fully able to be in this moment because we're automatically responding to the other. And although it's true for all of us in different ways, it helps to think about the really big situation. So you think of, are any of y'all veterans? Okay, so one of the things that is really common in brain patterns of a returning veteran is a imbalance in the temporal lobes, because the temporal lobe right side activates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. And the left side is our access point to the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and relax, right, which is the coming down, and which is also the freeze response in the trauma sequence. Think about what happens with a cat and mouse. The mouse first runs, right, fight or flight, but when it's caught, it completely shuts down. It just goes limp.
Yep.
The parasympathetic nervous system is overridden and it's flooded with anesthesia, so that if it's injured, it doesn't feel it. Right? So it's very useful, right? It's exactly how we're designed to respond this way. The problem is that we can get stuck in these patterns. So somebody coming back, a veteran, is very often, especially like a single tour veteran, is very often have a much higher brainwave activity on the right side of the temporal lobe, and the way that's experienced in life is automatic fight or flight, right? It's disproportional response to events. Interestingly enough, somebody who's had multiple tours often ends up left side dominant, because now their automatic response to threat is emotion, at least, to completely shut down, numbness, disassociation, right? So now, and you can see that in a brain assessment, right? And a couple of you guys have been through this. It's amazing what you can read off of an EEG assessment when you've got enough data in your database with correlations on how the brainwave activity is reflected in our experience. So this would be like a brain that's perfectly balanced in any particular lobe. Let's just take the temporal lobes for a moment. And you can see they're not exactly the same. Right? And that's because we have different strengths, right? The different sides of the brain do slightly different things overall, not just in each lobe. But say somebody who is having this overreactivity situation is going to look more like this, right? So because this is peaking, the right side is peaking so much higher than the left side because there's so much more activity. But you still notice how there's a crossover at times, and so that's what we call a floating middle range. So what our software does, what the technology does that we've licensed, is it's using a specialized EEG assessment, a pretty basic EEG assessment, to read the brainwave activity in certain select parts of the brain. And then, for example, if the assessment has turned out that this person is strongly right side dominant, this veteran that we're using as this example, then his brain's going to look like this, right? Or her brain's going to look like this. And every 0.25 milliseconds, what the software is doing is watching for any point where there's the crossover, that balance. And so to speak, is taking a snapshot of that. Snapshot, 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 snapshot. And it's linking those together into a movie, if you will, translating that into sound waves, and then it's fed back to the person. And so what his brain is doing is this, and what he's hearing is this.
Balance.
Right? He's hearing this. And it's crazy, right? I mean, my heart is touched every single time I'm watching somebody, especially if I know their story of what's happened, because, and Steve, we were just showing this to you today, right? We showed this picture, that we see a live graph, to be this way, this right side is on top. We show a live graph that looks like this, that's tracking just the peaks and valleys of the frequencies, right? And so it'll be going like this, right, which is this representation. Meanwhile, the person is hearing this, and it'll go 5-6 minutes, and it just lines right up. And all of a sudden, the two sides come together and they're balanced. Because we've been created to move toward balance, right? And when we have the information, we have the brain information to do that, the brain lines it up, right? And so,
it's a reflective principle. It's reflection.
Exactly. It's a mirror of our optimal functioning, right? Because if everybody in the room was hooked up at the same time, we'd all hear different patterns. Because our balance, our floating middle range, each one of us is unique, right? It's completely different. Right? But all of us would move toward balance because that's how we're designed.
I love that.
So the technology allows your brain to hear itself think.
Exactly.
And it
So
restores balance.
it answers the question, how do you think about how you think?
That's right.
Yeah.
How do you think about it? How do you do it? Right? And then here is again, as I said, we wouldn't have believed it was possible a number of years ago, because how is it that could the brain take audio information and actually recognize that information is a certain lobe and do something with it? Well, do you guys want to know?
Yeah,
right?
I got to run.
Right, good. We have no idea. This works. I don't know how, but it works the same principle. Do you guys know about the cameras for the blind?
Yeah.
Right? Works on the same principle that, and some of you guys have heard me tell these stories. It's this exact same principle that wouldn't have been believed a number of years ago. In fact, it's been started. Paul Bacchi-Rita, a neuroscientist, started in the '60s, and nobody believed him until the late *80s that it could be done at all. There are now cameras that are run to leads on the tongue. When you touch your tongue, right, the somatosensory cortex right here is where that gets read, because it's physical information, right? Same thing, if you do that, that's all read there. But electrical impulses from this camera, after being read in the somatosensory cortex for a certain period of time, for no reason whatsoever that any neuroscientist knows, the brain knows to send that information to the visual cortex, even if the visual cortex has been reprocessed by the brain from birth, because the person's blind. And this, if you think about arguments for design, think about this: a person's brain that has never had any visual images on the retina whatsoever because they're blind from birth, their brain can figure out that the electrical impulses that are representative of visual signals coming from a camera should be processed in the visual cortex, and then they have images. Right? And even though we don't know how the brain does all these different things, there are now a whole bunch of developments in neuroscience where they're using the fact that the brain can take information from other ways and use it. And then what we do is then following some of the things that Dr. Leaf does, right? Or not following them, but parallel and using the same kind of principles. Is then we say, okay, the brain's coming into balance. Now, how can we teach all of the tools that are available, and teach all the things that most people don't know about their brain, and they're destroying their personal lives and their spiritual lives because they don't know things like the neurons that fire together wire together. So they find themselves. So they dwell on wounds. They dwell on lustful thoughts. They dwell on things, and they say, well, look, it's okay. It doesn't matter, right? They don't realize that they're actually wiring the processes there, and then they wonder,